running, testing, and debugging Mule applications. Running Mule applications is pretty simple. Anypoint Studio comes with a complete embedded Mule runtime to test applications without having to leave Studio, without having to deploy to a standalone server. The console outputs application logs and information for us to see. There's several options for making requests to an endpoint. Assuming that it's based on HTTP, that endpoint could be hit with any old web browser, a curl command line utility, a browser extension such as Postman for Google Chrome. In fact, we'd recommend having a tool like Postman around for when we get into our more API-oriented pieces. Debugging applications inside of Mule is an EE-only feature, and it's quite simple to set up. Similar to a debugger in most programming languages, we can add breakpoints to the processors and step through the application as the message moves from one message processor to the next. We can watch the message and variable values as they go through, and also evaluate expressions. Debugger listens for incoming TCP connections on localhost 6666. This port is configurable if your machine has contention. So, without further ado, let's get in and run and debug our own Hello World application. In this walkthrough, we're going to run a Mule app using the embedded ESB runtime, make an HTTP request to an endpoint via a web browser or tool like curl or Postman, receive a response with the text Hello World, redeploy the application, and then use the Mule debugger to debug an application. Let's get started. To get started with running, testing, and debugging our application, we'll need to, of course, make sure we're open in Anypoint Studio. Once Anypoint Studio is open, let's talk about running our application for the first time. As you might recall, we exposed an HTTP endpoint, which is exposed on localhost /8081/SFDC. We're then triggering a set payload component that should say Hello World. And we've also dropped in something called a logger that we haven't really explored too much so far. Now again, we'll make sure our project is completely saved up before continuing on. And let's go ahead and run this project. One really easy way to run the project is to go up to your Run button, drop down, and as needed, you can click Run As or select Run As, Mule Application. At this time, the console window should pop up automatically, and you should see some information as your app is being initialized. If all goes well and there's no configuration errors, you'll see that your application AP start was deployed, and you'll also see that Mule is up and kicking. We now should be good to test out our application. So let's do that. Inside of a web browser, I'm going to be using Postman to send this request out, just to make things as clean as possible. So if I go in and I request HTTP localhost 8081/SFDC and then click send, I'm going to see a response come back that says Hello World. So we know that our application exposed on 801 SFDC is in fact returning the payload that we have set. Pretty cool. Now, if we flip back to our Mule application for just a moment here and examine the console closely, we should notice that some information has popped up inside of the console. In fact, right under the deployed box, I can see where my logger message processor fired off. In fact, with close examination, you should be able to see some important details about your Mule message. Things like what the Mule message ID was, what the payload's class was, in this case a java.lang.string, what the encoding of that string payload was as well. Notice that there's also 4 available scopes to us: an invocation scoped properties, inbound scope properties, outbound scope properties, and session scoped properties as well. All of these providing us a lot of good detail. In fact, we'll notice that a lot of these inbound scope properties look like HTTP headers that typically come in with the request. As an example, I can even see what HTTP method called this particular resource. Now our Mule is actively running, meaning we can keep sending requests to it and continue getting Hello World. Now let's talk about turning off this Mule server for the time being. In the console window, you'll notice the red square, the stop button, or terminate. Let's go ahead and click terminate. Now our Mule application has been stopped and we are currently in development mode again. Not that we couldn't have been developing while it was running. Let's now take a look at rerunning this application after a subtle change. So if we go in and we change the actual set payload transformer to a different value, so in this case, we'll go ahead and select set payload, and I'm going to change the set payload instead of saying hello world to say good night world, and I encourage you to do the same. So hello world to good night world. And now we're going to go ahead and click in the canvas. You'll notice that the save option here is now available to be saved. A change has not been saved in short. So I'm going to save everything up again. And then let's go ahead and run the application one more time. All right. So now we've turned the entire Mule server off, started it back up, and redeployed the application. Now if I go back inside of Postman for a moment and send the request one more time, notice that I get the response goodbye world. So it's quite clear that we can make a configuration change, start and stop our Mule, or stop and start our Mule, and see the change. Now there's also a principle inside of Studio called hot deployment that will do something similar as well, without making us stop the server completely, but just simply by invoking the changes or redeploying the app. As an example, let's go ahead and double click on set payload. And let's change this one more time. So I'm going to change it from good night world to good afternoon world. All right. Now, if I go into my console here and watch very closely, all I'm going to do, notice our Mule right now is still running. I have not clicked terminate. I'm just going to go ahead and click save up here. Once that save fires off with our configuration XML, Mule picks up on the fact that that file has been changed. And as you can tell, without me having to stop the server and start it again, the application changes have taken place. AKA, the application was hot redeployed. Going back into Postman one more time to make sure everything is working will prove that I'm now seeing my newest payload value. Last but not least, let's talk a little bit about debugging this application. Back inside of Studio, what we'll go ahead and do is add a couple debug breakpoints into the app. To do this, let's go ahead and set a breakpoint on top of set payload. And with this one breakpoint set up, let's run our application in debug mode. We can run in debug mode by clicking on the bug in the top left of AnyPoint Studio. Once we click on this bug, we're going to be prompted that a ESB is already running. Are we sure we want to stop it? And in this case, that's perfectly fine. Let's click yes. And subsequently, we should get one more pop-up in a second here, prompting us that our dialogue, our perspective is going to change. Let's also hit yes to this and let ourselves enter the debug perspective. All right, now the big change you should see is that instead of just the console output, we are popped up into a Mule debugger view where it says we're connected to ESB and waiting for a Mule message to arrive. If I go back into my web browser and send one more request in, I'll notice that my tool this time is just pending. It's just sitting here. Going back inside of Studio, I'll realize that the message has been stopped, and visually, due to this blue square here, I can actually see where my message is currently stopped. So now if we just take a look at some of the different areas here, we'll test out some of the different pieces. So basically, going inside a payload, I can see that right now my payload is just a null payload, meaning it seems, although my message is stopped here, the set payload has not actually fired off yet. Once again, similar to our logger, I can see a lot of the different values that were in console, a lot of the different inbound properties. Going through variables so far proves to be empty, outbound properties empty, session variables empty, and also record variables as well. What we'll do next inside of debugger is we're going to step into the logger, but notice I haven't put a breakpoint on the logger. Now, while this green button here would push me to the next breakpoint, I want to step to the next message processor, regardless of whether it has a breakpoint or not. By clicking this yellow arrow that's sort of bent upwards, I will then move on to the logger. Now, there should be one big change that you're able to see here inside of the debugging view. That change in particular is the newest payload that you've got. So the payload is now a java.lang.string rather than a null payload, and the value it contains is good afternoon world. So the debugger is going to be a huge help as we go through class in order to look at the different things that are happening in our application and hopefully solve a lot of different problems. Now, one last thing I'll mention as well is when we first started debugger, we got a pop-up about switching perspectives. Right now we're in the debug perspective in Studio. If you look in the top right of Studio, you'll notice there's a Mule debug perspective and also a Mule design perspective. In all honesty, you really can develop in both of these, but as far as the Mule debug perspective goes, it just gives you some extra dialogues you might not normally need unless you're debugging. So for the time being, let's go ahead and push our message through. So I'll actually click the little green arrow down here, go back to my Postman and see that I did get a response back. So even though I was in debugger, as long as I send the message all the way through, I'll still get a response. And I'm also going to make sure that I stop my application. That way my Mule is not running in the background. All right. And if we also wish to choose the design mode again, we can click the design perspective and we'll be right back in our main design perspective in Studio. Good work with testing and debugging your first Mule application. Let's take a look at our next chunk of content.